Hi, this is Michelle Goodman with the Claremont Law Journal, and sitting with me is Professor Jerome Cohen, who's with NYU Law School. He's a foremost authority on Chinese and most Indonesian and international law, as well as all the different current happenings overseas and with them. He recently came back from a trip to Taiwan. In fact, he was received by the president there and was given a letter of congratulations. So he is a rather big deal. So now we're going to talk a little bit about international law in general, and more specifically what it has to do with the current tensions between Japan and China in relation to the Senkaku and the Diaoyu Islands. I'm sure I said those wrong, so I'm going to let Professor Cohen go about maybe starting with a little bit of the background about what the tension is between the two islands.
Well, the tension between China and Japan is only part of a larger picture of tension surrounding what many people call the rise of China. What other people say is the return of China to world prominence, since it's only been 150 years that China has not been a dominant power in the world. So right now, China's expression of its rise, giving some vent to nationalist sentiment in China to express their pride and their accomplishment and the economic power that China has developed and the growing military power that others respect. The principal manifestation of this is the sea. China, all along its periphery, has been, you might say, pounding its chest. It has been showing its stuff, strutting, demanding not only that Japan respect its views on the law of the sea and the territorial questions relating to it, but it has also taken similar postures vis-a-vis South Korea, even North Korea, its ally, and certainly with respect to the South China Sea as well as the East China Sea. In the South China Sea, you have a very sharp conflict between China and the Philippines, which I want to mention shortly because it's profoundly important in international law terms. You have a very sharp conflict between these two socialist allies, Vietnam and China. And you have Chinese disputes over other aspects of the South China Sea with some of the other neighbors, including Malaysia. Even Indonesia, which is further south, feels some impact of this. So the struggle with Japan over these islands is only part of a bigger picture. Now, I should also say the struggle with Japan over these islands is certainly not just over these islands. This is really a profound historical antipathy, hatred, you could say, between the two major powers of East Asia. We could think about, we take for granted now that France and Germany get along well, but you have to understand that in my lifetime, France and Germany were hated enemies. They had gone to war repeatedly in the 19th and 20th century. And the great achievement of post-World War II Europe is that they have managed to reconcile. Doesn't mean that they have agreement on all the contentious questions that they confront, but they really are singing from the same page. This is an enormous achievement, and many of us have been urging the leaders of Japan and China to do the same. So Chinese say they're willing to do it, but how can you reconcile with a country that, unlike Germany, has failed to recognize how awful its conduct was in the 1930s and 40s vis-a-vis China? You have not had a comparable recognition of the past in Japan compared to what Germany has put itself through. And just the other day, this big dispute that flared up again about the visit of the Japanese Prime Minister Abe to Yasukuni Shrine, where many of the war criminals of Japan, including those condemned to death and executed, have their remains stored. This is full of symbolism. So this isn't a dispute about a few piles of rock. This is a dispute about very, very serious, long-running relationship, and it's poisoning China's reputation. It's poisoning its relations with not just Japan, but the rest of East Asia, Northeast Asia, and Southeast Asia. Now, what about these piles of rock? In the 1880s and early 1890s, culminating in 1894-95, while Japan was at war with China, the Japanese government was investigating its desire, was it feasible or not, to implement its desire to take these islands. And they decided that they couldn't do it publicly because China would object. China was too sensitive to what obviously the Japanese thought meant China had a claim to these islands. And so what the Japanese did in January 1895 was they secretly annexed these islands. They adopted a decree that was not made public, claiming that the islands were terra nullius, as we say in international law, that, in other words, a territory not owned by anybody, empty land that they therefore could claim these islands. But they didn't do it publicly. It wasn't until, I think, 1943, if you could believe it, that Japan made public its claim to these islands. Then nobody gave a damn about these islands until 1968. 1968, there was a UN survey looking for oil and gas resources in that area. And shortly afterward, a report was issued saying that it might be that underlying these islands, you had huge deposits of oil and gas. And at that point, bells started ringing. And people noticed that these islands existed. The Chinese government, after World War II, didn't take account of these islands. They're just piles of rock. They were worried about the status of Taiwan, which was very, very important. So neither the Chiang Kai-shek government nor the Mao Zedong government that continued to compete after Chairman Mao and the Communist Party took over the mainland in 1949, neither of those governments really showed any interest in those islands until you had this report on their resources. And at that point, the Japanese government said, when Okinawa is returned to us on May 15, 1972, these islands, which were also, after World War II, like Okinawa, under American administration, that these islands would naturally revert to Japan. And at that point, 1972, in the spring, it was obvious that China and Japan had a very, very serious dispute. And the problem was how to handle it. I remember giving a talk at the annual meeting of the Harvard Club of Japan in April 1972, and I talked about this topic because already there were almost warlike clashes between ships, boats, etc., of China and Japan about these islands. So this is not a new problem. But initially, Deng Xiaoping, when he took over control of China in late 78, 79, he and the Japanese government agreed, let's just put these questions aside. And for 40 years, they have not been an active source of dispute. Nothing dangerous has happened, although the dispute has continued despite attempts to reconcile and have some joint development in the area, but that proved too difficult. But beginning a year ago, the Japanese government upset China very greatly by itself purchasing several of these islands from the private Japanese owner that had possessed them. And China has taken that as an abandonment by Japan of the agreement made with Deng Xiaoping, just to keep this issue aside, don't deal with it. And China has become very angry, claiming that it's a nationalization of the islands by Japan. And that cancels their earlier understanding. And since then, Chinese have done a lot in a very assertive way, shall we say gently, to make the world aware that they claim these islands belong to them. And the Japanese government, of course, tries to resist that. And this has led to a series of incidents that make us worry that violence will occur, people will be killed, and the nationalism that exists in each country against the other will be further stoked and could lead to hostilities. Some people are recalling how World War I started, and these things have a life of their own if they get started. So we're facing a very dangerous situation in the East China Sea. Each side says, of course we're really willing to discuss this matter, except we're right. And we have a perfect international law position to show the islands belong to us. And the other side says the same thing. Well, something has to be done. And the question is, what can be done? My view is it's quite simple. There are in existence international legal mechanisms, institutions, arbitration tribunals, courts for resolving these questions. And some countries have managed to use these international institutions rather than let ridiculous struggles over petty, intrinsically petty questions get out of hand. And some Asian countries have gone to the International Court of Justice. And of course, the US and Canada have resolved some of their disputes in a peaceful way. So I have recommended that China and Japan put aside these questions by taking them to the International Court of Justice. And each claims they have good legal merits to their case. Let them put it to an impartial, fair tribunal with the understanding that they'll abide by the decision. But neither side is willing to do that. The Japanese have hinted that they're willing to do that. The previous administration, before Abe took over, they made a statement through their foreign minister that Japan believes in international law. Japan has agreed to submit to the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, but neither the US nor China has done that. And they said, if China wants to take us to the ICJ, that way we'll handle the question. Well, I'd like to see the Abe government do the same thing. I think it'd be very smart of them to do that because they know China will never accept that. But it would make Japan look like a sincere proponent of international law, and it would make China think you just can't make these statements without being put to the test. Eventually, China is going to have to learn more about international law and agree to use its institutions. But it takes time. One of my favorite expressions in Chinese is everything requires a process. Shuyao Ika Guoqiang. Rome wasn't built in a day. In 1972, I had the chance to sit like you and I are sitting with Prime Minister Zhou Enlai. We had dinner and talked for 4 hours. And in the third hour or so, I got my nerve up and I thought I have to make a proposal to them. I said, now that the PRC represents China in the United Nations, which had happened the previous year, I said, you should name a justice to go on the International Court of Justice. That's one of the perks of being a great power, to be represented on the International Court of Justice. When I said that, Zhou Enlai and the people around the table who worked with him, they laughed uproariously. They thought I was a comedian. To them, that was the most ludicrous thought anybody could have. Why would China, a communist power, an Asian power, that had always felt the bourgeoisie of the world paid no attention to it and would outvote them on the International Court of Justice, why would they want to put a representative on that court? They always mistrusted international law and international courts. And I said to them, I'm not joking. You are going to want to have somebody on that court. Well, it took them over a decade, but then they started appointing people, and they've always appointed very able people. And they take part in the ICJ, but they haven't come around to the point of being willing to submit an important territorial dispute to any third party because they lose control over the decision. With negotiation, you retain control. If you have a mediator has no power to decide, merely to make suggestions. You don't lose control. But China is afraid of they won't get a fair shake, and maybe they don't have as strong a legal case as they claim to. And of course, the Japanese case, as I've indicated, also has big holes. That's why they kept their annexation of these islands secret for so many years. So it's a great case here, but the important thing is that we not allow it to get out of control. On the South China Sea, there's a relevant development to this. The Philippines and China have had a serious series of disputes over the law of the sea questions and over the ownership of certain features in the South China Sea that each claims. And having tried for almost 20 years to negotiate a solution with China, last January, just a year ago, the Philippines stunned China and the world by taking their dispute to the arbitration of the International Law Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. This Law of the Sea Tribunal is assigned the task of deciding disputes relating to the law of the sea under the treaty, UNCLOS, the UN, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, that China has ratified and the Philippines has ratified. And under that convention, if there are disputes as to its meaning, you're supposed to go to this tribunal. There are several options, but they're all the same. You commit yourself, when you commit yourself to the treaty, to deciding any disputes about the treaty's meaning by going to this law of the sea system. And the Philippines has done so. But China has refused to go. This is an obligation under the treaty. In the WTO, when China signed up for that system, they have a similar provision. You must go to the WTO arbitration system for resolving disputes. China has done that. And China has learned to take part. That's progress. Sometimes they win a case, sometimes they lose, but they've learned after a few years to play the game. But with respect to these much more serious, sensitive questions involving who owns territory, China shows no sign yet of being willing to go to arbitration. So we're waiting to see now what will happen with the Philippine case. China's not taking part, but the process is going forward. And it may well be that the Philippines will win this case, and then China will be faced with the further international law question. Will it abide by the decision, or is it going to thumb its nose at this international law decision? We don't know. But I would like to see Japan put China to its challenge by taking the question of the islands to the International Court of Justice, or to agree on a special arbitration tribunal. I've also suggested, since Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia lack the kinds of institutions that Europe has developed after World War II, that maybe a regional tribunal should be agreed to by the countries of East Asia if they fear the biases of Westerners before Western tribunals. Let them create their own impartial decision-making possibilities. I think we need more adventuresome, imaginative efforts by diplomats and governments. Otherwise, we're going to be faced with increasingly serious political, military crises in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And by the way, the United States is not in a great position to make demands in this respect, because the United States hasn't even ratified this UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So we're in a poor position to criticize anybody. Moreover, under President Reagan in the mid-'80s, the United States thumbed its nose at a decision of the International Court of Justice concerning Nicaragua. And so we look very bad, and I think we ought to smell better. And it would be important for the Senate finally to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So
do you think that the way of the future might be to have all nations, push for the international system, push for international law, push for the respect of these tribunals and courts that are not above their nation? Is that the best way to go? Is that the way of the future?
Of course, we have a rules-based world community, and China and Japan and the other powers have to respect those rules. And these are not rules that were imposed on China against its will or before the communist government came to power. The People's Republic of China, which represents China in the world, they took part in the negotiation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They are original participants in that process going back to when they entered the UN in 1971. So they have influence. And if they thumb their nose at the Convention on the Law of the Sea and at the International Court of Justice, it's going to be a serious blow to international law. But in order to get them to play the game, Japan and the United States also have to take it more seriously. So right now we're facing a great challenge and an opportunity for the further development of international law among the leading powers of the world, because the United States, China, and Japan are really now the three world leaders.
So it looks like we've got our orders and we need to adapt more international law. Thank you, Professor, and thank you for watching.